America had no income tax until 1913. Here's something that might surprise you. For the first 124 years of American history, the federal government never touched your paycheck. Not 1%. Not a dime. For most of that time, up to 90% of federal revenue came from a single source. Taxes on goods crossing the border, paid not by workers, but baked invisibly into the price of everything they bought. A farmer in the 1880s could go his entire life without ever filing a form with the federal government, and still hand over a hidden tax every time he bought a bolt of cloth, a bag of sugar, or a tin of coffee. A dockworker's family in Boston might never see a single line of federal paperwork, yet still pay, in higher prices at every shop in town, for a government whose spending they had no direct say in. This is the story of how the United States ran itself for over a century without an income tax, why that system quietly favored the wealthy while squeezing everyone else, and the decades-long fight it took to finally change it. The problem the founders were trying to solve had nothing to do with fairness. It was simpler and more urgent than that. The brand new United States government was broke, and it needed a way to raise money without provoking the kind of tax revolt that had started the revolution in the first place. The Constitution gave Congress the power to lay taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, but it drew a sharp distinction that would matter enormously more than a century later. So-called direct taxes had to be apportioned among the states according to population, while indirect taxes on goods and transactions did not. That distinction, tucked into Article 1, was about to define the boundaries of federal taxation for the next 100+ years. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, built his entire financial system around import tariffs and a handful of narrow excise taxes, because they were the easiest kind of tax to collect from a young, sprawling, and largely rural country with no meaningful federal bureaucracy. Customs officers only had to watch a relative handful of ports. Nobody had to go door to door assessing the value of every citizen's income or property. There was also a deeper strategic logic behind it. Hamilton wanted the new federal government to demonstrate it could pay its debts and fund itself reliably, in order to build credibility with domestic and foreign creditors alike. And a tariff, collected quietly at the point goods entered the country, was far less likely to trigger the kind of popular backlash that direct taxation had provoked under British rule just a decade or two earlier. Now, what does this mean for an ordinary person living through it? It means the tax code of the early republic was built, quite deliberately, to be as invisible as possible, a system where the government could fund itself without most citizens ever consciously feeling they were being taxed at all. In 1791, at Hamilton's urging, Congress passed an excise tax on distilled spirits to help pay down Revolutionary War debt. That tax landed hardest on cash-poor farmers in western Pennsylvania, who relied on whiskey not just as a product but as an informal currency, since hauling raw grain over the mountains to eastern markets was often more expensive than the grain itself was worth. By 1794, resistance to the tax had escalated into armed revolt. Tax collectors tarred and feathered, homes burned, federal marshals chased off at gunpoint. Rebel forces reportedly swelled to as many as 5,000 men in the summer of 1794. President Washington personally rode out at the head of nearly 13,000 militiamen to put down what became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. The revolt was crushed without a major battle, but the lesson stuck with generations of American lawmakers that followed. Direct taxation of ordinary citizens was politically radioactive, and taxing goods at the border or the point of production was, comparatively, easy money nobody had to watch being taken out of their pocket. From that point through the Civil War, tariffs did almost all of the work. From 1790 to 1860, tariffs accounted for roughly 90% of all federal revenue. The system was simple, largely invisible to the average citizen, and, crucially, regressive, meaning it took a much bigger bite proportionally out of a poor family's income than a wealthy one's, since working people spent a far higher share of what they earned on the tax goods of everyday life. But tariffs were never just a quiet revenue mechanism. They became one of the most explosive political issues of the early 19th century, because setting a tariff rate wasn't a neutral accounting decision. It was also industrial policy, protecting northern factories from cheaper foreign competition while raising costs for the largely agricultural South, which imported far more manufactured goods than it exported. The Tariff of 1828, which Southern critics nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations, raised duties so sharply that South Carolina moved to nullify it outright within the state, triggering a constitutional crisis over whether a state could simply refuse to enforce a federal law it disagreed with. Some historians point to that fight as an early rehearsal for the sectional conflict that would eventually erupt into civil war 3 decades later. The tariff, in other words, was never simply about funding the government. It was a lever that could be pulled to reward one region's industry at another region's expense, and every adjustment to it produced winners and losers well before anyone in Washington seriously discussed taxing income directly. The Civil War blew a hole in the old system that tariffs alone couldn't fill. By July 1861, Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase estimated the Union would need roughly $320 million just to fight the war through the following year, a number that would prove wildly optimistic. Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1861, creating the nation's first federal income tax, a flat 3% on incomes over $800, worth something like $28,000 today. It barely had time to be collected before Congress overhauled it. The Revenue Act of 1862 replaced the flat rate with the country's first progressive income tax, 3% on incomes between $600 and $10,000, 5% above that, and, in the same law, created the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the direct ancestor of today's IRS. The act also piled excise taxes onto dozens of everyday goods: liquor, tobacco, carriages, jewelry, even telegrams. To actually collect any of it, the commissioner divided the states and territories still loyal to the Union into collection districts, each staffed by federal assessors who had never before existed in most Americans' daily lives. An entirely new layer of government reaching directly into ordinary households for the first time in the country's history. Here's the thing: nobody in Washington believed this income tax was a permanent fixture. It was framed explicitly as a wartime emergency measure, collected under threat of the Union's survival. And Congress wrote its own expiration into the law from the start, specifying the tax would apply only through 1866, and no longer. Rates climbed further in 1864 as the war dragged on and the debt kept mounting. But once the fighting ended and Reconstruction began, public appetite for a tax on personal income evaporated fast. Congress cut the rates in 1867 under mounting public pressure, and let the whole income tax expire in 1872. For the next 2 decades, the federal government went right back to funding itself almost entirely off tariffs and a narrower set of excise taxes, mostly liquor and tobacco, which by the late 1860s and through the rest of the century supplied something like 90% of all federal revenue. And what does this mean in practice? It means that for 2 more generations, a factory worker in Pittsburgh or a tenant farmer in Georgia paid, invisibly embedded in the price of every drink and every plug of chewing tobacco, a tax that a railroad baron or a Wall Street financier, someone who might spend a much smaller fraction of his income on either, barely felt at all. By the 1880s and 1890s, that arrangement was becoming impossible to ignore. Industrial fortunes were exploding in scale in a way the country had never seen. Men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt were accumulating wealth on a scale that dwarfed anything in the pre-Civil War economy, while tariffs kept consumer prices high for everyone else and industrial wages stagnated through repeated depressions. Sugar, in particular, became a flashpoint. The heavily tariff sugar trade was dominated by a handful of politically connected refiners, and reformers pointed to it constantly as proof that tariff protection, sold to the public as a way to shield American industry, often just entrenched a handful of powerful companies at consumers' expense. A political movement built almost entirely out of farmers and laborers, the populace, began demanding that the tax burden shift toward wealth and income rather than the goods ordinary families bought to survive. They argued with real force that a system funding the government almost entirely through tariffs and liquor and tobacco taxes was, by its very structure, a tax on survival rather than a tax on success. A poor family spending nearly everything it earned paid tax on nearly everything it earned, while a fortune sitting untouched in stocks, bonds, or land paid nothing at all. Then, in 1893, a brutal financial panic tore through the economy, banks failed, unemployment spiked, and federal revenue collapsed along with it, since falling trade meant falling tariff collections at exactly the moment the government needed money most. Congress, scrambling for revenue and under real political pressure from populist and Democratic reformers, attached a modest income tax to the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act of 1894, a 2% tax on incomes above $4,000, worth roughly $90,000 today, meaning it would have applied to a genuinely small slice of the wealthiest Americans. President Grover Cleveland, no particular fan of the income tax provision himself, let the bill become law without his signature rather than veto the broader tariff reduction it was attached to. It lasted less than a year. A stockholder named Charles Pollock sued to block the Farmers Loan and Trust Company from paying the new tax, arguing it was an unapportioned direct tax forbidden by the Constitution. The case, Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, reached the Supreme Court in early 1895, and on April 8, in a 5-4 decision, the court agreed, ruling that a tax on income derived from property, like rents, dividends, and interest, functioned as a direct tax and therefore had to be apportioned among the states by population, something a tax on income could never practically do. Weeks later, on rehearing, the court extended the ruling to strike down the entire income tax law. Two of the dissenting justices didn't hold back. One accused the majority of essentially inventing a new constitutional rule to protect concentrated wealth, dismissing what he called irrelevant economic reasoning while ignoring more than a century of precedent that had treated taxes like this as indirect, not direct. The decision effectively slammed the door on a federal income tax for the next 18 years, and it did so by a single vote, on a court that had flipped its own position on a rehearing just weeks after the first ruling. Picture the scene inside the marble chamber that April morning in 1895. Chief Justice Melville Fuller reading the majority opinion aloud to a courtroom packed with lawyers and reporters who understood, even as the words were being spoken, that this ruling would protect the largest fortunes in American history from federal taxation for a generation. Outside, newspapers across the industrial cities ran headlines calling it a triumph for organized wealth. Farmers and workers' organizations, who had spent years pushing the modest 1894 tax through Congress only to watch 9 unelected men erase it with a 5-4 vote, saw it as confirmation of exactly what the populist movement had been arguing all along, that the institutions of government, courts included, tilted toward protecting concentrated capital over ordinary income. Congress, for its part, largely gave up on the idea for the rest of the decade. Any member who wanted to revisit the question of income taxation now had to reckon not just with hostile colleagues and business lobbying, but with a Supreme Court precedent that had, in the span of a single spring, redefined what counted as a direct tax under the Constitution. The fight. The man who did more than almost anyone to reverse Pollock was a Democratic congressman from a poor rural district in Tennessee named Cordell Hull, a man who would later go on to serve as Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State, but who spent the first 2 decades of the 20th century almost entirely focused on this one issue. Hull called the existing tariff-based tax system, in a phrase he used repeatedly on the House floor, an infamous system of class legislation that forced the working man to shoulder the cost of government while virtually exempting the great industrial fortunes of the era with their aggregated billions of hoarded wealth. In a March 1909 speech he would repeat, in one form or another, for years afterward, Hull insisted he had no desire to tax wealth unnecessarily or unjustly, only that the wealth of the country ought to bear its just share of the burden of taxation, rather than being permitted to shirk that duty. Beginning around 1907, Hull began building support for a constitutional amendment that would explicitly authorize a federal income tax, sidestepping the Pollock ruling entirely rather than trying to craft a law clever enough to survive it. Then came one of the stranger political miscalculations in American legislative history. As Hull slowly built a coalition of Southern and Western congressmen behind income tax legislation in Congress, not yet enough votes to pass anything outright, but enough to genuinely worry his opponents, conservative lawmakers grew alarmed enough to try a different tactic. They offered to sponsor a constitutional amendment authorizing the income tax outright, gambling that reformers would abandon their legislative push in favor of the amendment, and that the amendment itself would then die quietly in the state legislatures, since ratification required 3/4 of all states to agree, a bar high enough that plenty of similar amendments throughout American history had simply withered on the vine. Senator Norris Brown of Nebraska formally proposed the amendment on June 17, 1909. President William Howard Taft, a conservative Republican who nonetheless sensed which way public opinion was shifting, sent Congress a message that same year urging exactly this path. The trap backfired spectacularly. The amendment sailed through the Senate by a vote of 77-0 and through the House by 318-14 in the summer of 1909. Margins so lopsided that the lawmakers who had proposed the amendment as a poison pill had badly misjudged just how much public support for taxing wealth had already built up beneath them. Hull later wrote that watching the amendment rush through both chambers by such overwhelming majorities felt like the fruition of 20 years of his own work and study, even though the hardest part, actual ratification by the states, still lay ahead of him. That ratification fight took nearly 4 years, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion. It needed 36 of the then 48 states to say yes. Progressive Republicans, some of whom would soon split off to form Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, pushed for it as a matter of fairness, believing a federal income tax would give Washington the financial capacity to match America's growing industrial and military power. Conservative business interests in northeastern industrial states lobbied hard against it, correctly recognizing that a federal income tax would fall almost entirely on their own wealth. The tide turned decisively with the 1912 election, when Woodrow Wilson's Democrats swept into power on a platform that explicitly linked income tax reform to lowering the tariffs that had squeezed ordinary consumers for over a century. State by state, the ratifications piled up through 1911 and 1912. On February 3, 1913, just 1 month before Wilson's inauguration, Secretary of State Philander Knox certified that the required 36 states had ratified the 16th Amendment, and it became part of the Constitution. Wilson made tariff reduction and income tax reform his very first legislative priority as president. Representative Oscar Underwood of Alabama, chairing the House Ways and Means Committee, sponsored the bill that would become the Revenue Act of 1913, commonly called the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, with Cordell Hull once again doing much of the drafting work on the income tax provision itself. Underwood argued in his committee report that the new tax was, in his words, the fairest and cheapest of all taxes, one that good citizens would willingly support to secure a more equal distribution of the burden of government. On October 3, 1913, Wilson signed it into law. The act cut average tariff rates from roughly 40% down to 26%, and it imposed a 1% tax on individual income above $3,000 for single filers, with a separate 1% corporate tax layered on top. The tax reached only a small slice of the country by design. Here's what actually changed on the ground in real numbers the moment the Revenue Act of 1913 took effect. The 1% baseline tax applied only to income above $3,000 a year, roughly $90,000 in today's money, a threshold high enough that it touched only about 3% of the American population. A graduated surtax on top of that, climbing as high as 6%, applied only to the very largest incomes, above $500,000. For the overwhelming majority of American workers and farmers, October 1913 changed almost nothing about their day-to-day tax burden. The law was engineered from the start to fall on the wealthy few who had spent 2 decades benefiting from the Pollock decision. But the Channel's honest nuance rule applies here, because this reform did not fix everything, and it's worth being direct about what it left standing. The tariff system didn't disappear, it shrank, but tariffs and excise taxes on liquor and tobacco continued to supply a meaningful share of federal revenue for years afterward, meaning working-class Americans kept paying those older, regressive taxes on top of whatever new income tax touched their household. The income tax itself started out so narrow that it functioned almost like a tax on the upper class rather than a broad-based national tax. It wouldn't become something most working Americans actually paid until withholding was introduced during the Second World War, 3 decades later, and top marginal rates on the largest incomes would climb dramatically higher during that same era, far beyond anything Hull or Underwood had proposed in 1913. And a Republican-controlled Congress would go on to raise tariff rates again within a matter of years, meaning the shift away from tariff dependence Underwood and Hull fought for wasn't permanent policy so much as a temporary rebalancing that later Congresses reversed and restored more than once. Nor did the new amendment settle every legal question about federal taxing power. Courts would spend decades afterward litigating exactly what counted as income under the 16th Amendment's broad language, disputes that in various forms continue into the present day. This isn't ancient history. Cordell Hull was still a sitting member of Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet in the 1930s and 40s. The fight over whether income should be taxed at all happened within the lifetime of people whose own grandchildren may still be alive today. And the fundamental argument Hull was having with Gilded Age tariff defenders in 1909, should the government fund itself primarily by taxing consumption, which falls harder on ordinary spending, or by taxing income and wealth, which falls harder on the people who have more of it, has never actually gone away. It resurfaced explicitly in recent years, as proposals to expand tariffs and shrink or replace income taxation have returned to serious political debate, echoing almost precisely the funding structure the country ran on before 1913. Tariffs, which supplied up to 90% of federal revenue through most of the 19th century, now typically account for a small single-digit share of total federal revenue, Even a substantial increase in tariff collection would replace only a fraction of what individual income taxes alone bring in today. Whether that balance should shift back toward the pre-1913 model, and who would actually bear that cost if it did, is a live question being argued today in almost the same terms Hull and his opponents used more than a century ago. What makes the parallel especially striking is how closely the underlying tension has stayed the same, even as the numbers have grown by orders of magnitude. In 1913, a 1% tax touching 3% of the population felt, to its architects, like a modest and fair correction to a system that had let ordinary consumption carry the weight for over 100 years. Today's federal budget is almost unrecognizable in scale compared to 1913's. The government now spends a share of the economy that would have been unthinkable to Hamilton, Hull, or Underwood alike. But the basic design choice they fought over in the early 20th century, taxing what people earn versus taxing what people buy, still sits underneath every modern debate about who should pay for government and how much. It's worth asking, when a tax is invisible, baked into the price of things rather than itemized on a form once a year, does that make it easier to accept or easier to hide? If this story changed the way you think about that line on your paycheck, hit subscribe or drop a like. We go deep on hidden systems, money, and power, the stories most people never think about until the day they suddenly need to. I'll see you in the next